The Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, the Carnegies, the Morgans. Names that didn't just make money, they built America's industrial empire. Dynasties that shaped modern capitalism itself. Families so wealthy, they literally funded wars, built cities, and controlled entire industries. But here's what history books rarely mention. Every single one of these families had zero recorded wealth before the 1850s. Not some wealth, not modest wealth, zero. John D. Rockefeller's father was a con artist who sold fake cancer cures and abandoned his family for months at a time. Cornelius Vanderbilt started with a $100 loan to buy a sailboat. Andrew Carnegie arrived in America with his family owning exactly one trunk of belongings. J.P. Morgan's grandfather was a tavern keeper in Connecticut. And it's not just these four. Every major American dynasty that exists today follows the exact same pattern. Massive generational wealth appearing out of nowhere within a 30-year window. The explanation we're usually given: hard work, innovation, the American dream. That's not the full story. Not even close. Let's investigate what really happened between 1850 and 1880 that created the wealthiest families in human history. Before we dive deeper, you need to understand just how complete this pattern is. The Astors, the Carnegies, the Mellons, the Morgans, the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, the Guggenheims, the DuPonts, the Harrimans, the Huntingtons. These aren't just rich families. These are the families that own America. The families that built the railroads, controlled the oil, dominated steel production, ran the banks, and shaped government policy for over a century. And here's the striking detail no one talks about. If you go back to 1840 and try to find any of these names in wealth records, tax documents, or property holdings, you won't find them. Not because the records were lost, but because they didn't exist. The Vanderbilt fortune started in 1810, when Cornelius Vanderbilt was 16 years old. His mother loaned him $100 to buy a small sailboat to ferry passengers between Staten Island and Manhattan. That's it, $100 and a sailboat. By 1877, when he died, he was worth over $100 million. That's the equivalent of over $200 billion in today's money. From a $100 loan to the richest man in America in just 67 years. But the Vanderbilt story isn't unique. It's the template. Every single dynasty follows the same arc. Poverty or modest means before 1850. Explosive, almost incomprehensible wealth by 1880. And that timeline isn't a coincidence. The official story is industrialization. The rise of railroads, steel, oil, and banking created opportunities that didn't exist before. Smart men with vision seized those opportunities and built empires. Hard work, innovation, risk-taking, the American dream in action. And that is partially true, but it's not the full picture. Because industrialization happened in England too. It happened in France. It happened in Germany. But those countries didn't produce dozens of families with Vanderbilt-level wealth in a single generation. England had old money, aristocratic families wealthy for centuries. France had the same. Germany had the same. America was different. In America, the wealth didn't transfer from old aristocrats to new industrialists because there were no old aristocrats. The wealth appeared out of thin air. And the mechanism that made that possible wasn't just hard work and innovation. It was something far more deliberate. Let's start with the railroads, because that's where the real story begins. In 1850, America had about 9,000 miles of railroad track. By 1880, that number exploded to over 93,000 miles, the largest infrastructure project in human history up to that point. And every single mile of that track was built with government land grants, government subsidies, and government-backed bonds. The Pacific Railway Acts of 1862 and 1864 handed railroad companies like the Union Pacific and Central Pacific over 170 million acres of public land for free, an area larger than Texas. The government also gave loans worth tens of millions of dollars, at below-market interest rates. Cornelius Vanderbilt didn't just build railroads with his own money and compete in a free market. He bought politicians. He bribed legislators. He manipulated stock prices. He controlled shipping rates through backroom deals with government officials. His wealth wasn't created by innovation. It was extracted through monopoly power, guaranteed by the state. And the Vanderbilts weren't alone. Leland Stanford, one of the Big Four who built the Central Pacific Railroad, was simultaneously the governor of California, while his company received massive federal land grants. That's not a conflict of interest. That's open corruption. He literally wrote the laws that funded his own railroad. And when workers protested unsafe conditions or demanded fair wages, he used state militia to crush strikes. The official story of the railroad barons is that they connected America and built the infrastructure that made the country a superpower. And that's true. But they did it by extracting wealth from the government, exploiting immigrant labor, and using political power to eliminate competition. The free market had nothing to do with it. Now, let's talk about oil, because the Rockefeller story is even more revealing. John D. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil in 1870. Within 10 years, he controlled 90% of America's oil refining capacity. 90%. That's not innovation, that's monopoly. And the way he built that monopoly wasn't through better products or lower prices. It was through a strategy called railroad rebates. Here's how it worked. Rockefeller made secret deals with railroad companies. He would ship massive quantities of oil on their trains, and in exchange, they would give him rebates, not just discounts on his own shipments, but rebates on his competitors' shipments too. Every time a rival oil company shipped a barrel of oil, Rockefeller got paid. His competitors were literally funding his empire without even knowing it. This wasn't legal. It violated common carrier laws. But Rockefeller had enough political power that the laws weren't enforced. When some states tried to crack down, he simply restructured Standard Oil as a trust, creating a legal loophole that allowed him to operate across state lines without oversight. By 1880, Rockefeller was worth hundreds of millions. And he didn't get there by drilling more oil or refining it better. He got there by manipulating the system, crushing competition, and using political connections to avoid regulation. The invisible hand of the free market didn't create his wealth. The very visible hand of government did. But here's where it gets even more interesting. The same families that built wealth through railroads and oil also controlled the banks, and the banks controlled everything else. J.P. Morgan didn't start as a banker. His grandfather owned a tavern. His father became a merchant banker in London. But the family wasn't wealthy by aristocratic standards. J.P. Morgan's real fortune came from a single deal in 1879, when he helped the U.S. government sell bonds to refinance Civil War debt. He made millions in fees, and once he had that capital, he started buying up railroads, steel companies, and industrial firms. By 1900, J.P. Morgan controlled U.S. Steel, General Electric, and half a dozen major railroads. He was so powerful that when the U.S. government faced a financial crisis in 1907, they asked Morgan to bail them out. Think about that. The government went to a private banker and asked him to save the economy. And he did, because he had more liquid capital than the Treasury. Morgan didn't create value. He consolidated power. He bought struggling companies, merged them into monopolies, and then used those monopolies to extract wealth from everyone else. And the government didn't just allow it, they encouraged it, because Morgan's banks were the only institutions big enough to stabilize the financial system. This is the real story of how American dynasties were built not through innovation, but through consolidation of power, backed by government policy. And the pattern repeats across every major industry. Andrew Carnegie built his steel empire using the same playbook. He undercut competitors by manipulating freight rates through deals with railroads. He crushed labor unions with the help of state militias. And when he sold Carnegie Steel to J.P. Morgan in 1901 for $480 million, He became the richest man in the world overnight. But Carnegie didn't invent steel. He didn't even improve the manufacturing process in any revolutionary way. What he did was control the supply chain, eliminate competition, and use political power to maintain his monopoly. The Bessemer process that made cheap steel possible was invented in England. Carnegie just applied it in America, where labor was cheaper and government regulation was weaker. So why did this only happen in America? Why didn't England, France, or Germany create dozens of Rockefeller-level fortunes in the same time period? Because those countries had existing power structures, aristocratic families, established monopolies, strong labor movements. In England, if you wanted to build a railroad, you had to negotiate with landowners who had legal titles going back centuries. In America, the government just seized the land from Native Americans and handed it to railroad companies for free. European countries also had stronger regulations, banking laws, labor protections, antitrust frameworks. America had none of that until the early 1900s. The Gilded Age was called the Gilded Age for a reason. It looked like gold, but underneath it was corruption, exploitation, and wealth extraction on a scale the world had never seen. And the families that built that wealth didn't just get rich. They built dynasties that still control massive portions of the American economy today. The Rockefeller family still manages billions through trusts and foundations. The Morgans evolved into J.P. Morgan Chase, one of the largest banks in the world. The Vanderbilt fortune diluted over generations, but the name still carries weight in business and politics. These weren't self-made men who pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. They were opportunists who exploited a moment in history when the government was handing out land, subsidies, and monopoly power to anyone willing to take it. And once they had that power, they used it to rewrite the rules in their favor. The myths we tell about these families, the rags to riches stories, the celebration of their philanthropy, all of it obscures the real mechanism of wealth creation. Andrew Carnegie built libraries with his fortune, but he built that fortune by paying steelworkers starvation wages and using Pinkerton agents to shoot strikers. John D. Rockefeller donated millions to universities and medical research, but he made those millions by destroying competitors and manipulating markets. This isn't to say these men weren't smart, they were. This isn't to say they didn't work hard, they did. But intelligence and hard work alone don't create $100 billion fortunes. Systems do. And the system in America, between 1850 and 1880, was designed to transfer public wealth into private hands, at a speed and scale that had never happened before. The land grants alone transferred over 200 million acres of public land to private railroad companies. That's 10% of the entire United States, given away for free to corporations run by a handful of families. Imagine if the government did that today. Imagine if they gave Jeff Bezos 10% of America and said, "Build some infrastructure." People would riot. But in the 1800s, that's exactly what happened, and we celebrate the men who took the land as visionaries. The question isn't whether these families were smart or hardworking. The question is why the government created a system that allowed them to accumulate so much wealth so quickly. And the answer is that the government didn't have a choice. America was expanding. The country needed railroads, steel, oil, and banks. And there was no existing infrastructure to build those industries. So the government partnered with private capital and handed over control. But once those families had control, they never gave it back. They used their wealth to buy politicians, fund campaigns, and write laws that protected their monopolies. By the time the government tried to regulate them with antitrust laws in the early 1900s, it was too late. The dynasties were already entrenched. And here's the part that almost nobody talks about. The same families that built wealth through railroads, oil, and steel also controlled the media. William Randolph Hearst built a newspaper empire. Joseph Pulitzer did the same. Yet these men didn't just report the news, they shaped public opinion. They decided which stories got told and which stories got buried. So when you read about the Gilded Age in history books, you're reading a narrative crafted by the very people who benefited from the system. The rags to riches myth, the celebration of industrial progress, the idea that monopolies were necessary for economic growth, all of that was propaganda, designed to justify wealth extraction. And it worked. For over a century, Americans have celebrated these families as examples of what's possible in a free market. But there was no free market. There was a government-backed oligopoly that transferred public resources into private hands and called it capitalism. The revisionist economic history isn't a conspiracy theory, it's what happens when you actually look at the data. When you trace where the wealth came from, when you ask why every major American dynasty emerged in the same 30-year window, when you stop accepting the mythology and start examining the mechanisms, because the truth is that generational wealth in America wasn't created by the invisible hand of the market, it was created by the very visible hand of government policy. And the families that benefited from that policy have spent the last 150 years rewriting history to make it look like they earned it. The Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, the Carnegies, the Morgans, they didn't build America. They extracted America. And the dynasties they created still shape the economy, the government, and the distribution of wealth today. That's the story they don't teach in history class. That's the story that explains why every family that controls America today had no recorded wealth before the 1850s. Because the system that created that wealth didn't exist before the 1850s. And once it did exist, a handful of families seized control and never let go. The question isn't whether they were smart enough to take advantage of the opportunity. The question is whether we're smart enough to recognize that the opportunity shouldn't have existed in the first place. But let's go deeper. Because the railroad land grants and oil monopolies are just the surface. The real wealth extraction happened through something far more sophisticated, something that's still happening today. The manipulation of currency and credit. Before the Civil War, America didn't have a unified currency. Banks printed their own money. There were thousands of different types of banknotes circulating, and their value fluctuated wildly depending on the bank's reputation. This created chaos for commerce, but it also created opportunity for anyone who understood how to manipulate currency markets. The National Banking Acts of 1863 and 1864 changed everything. They created a unified national currency backed by government bonds. And here's the critical detail. The only way to get that currency was to buy government bonds first. So if you had capital, you could buy bonds, deposit them with the Treasury, and receive national banknotes worth 90% of the bond value. You were literally printing money backed by government debt. J.P. Morgan's father, Junius Spencer Morgan, was one of the first to understand this system. He bought massive quantities of Union bonds during the Civil War, when they were trading at steep discounts because people thought the North might lose. Then, when the North won, those bonds skyrocketed in value. Junius Morgan made millions, and his son J.P. Morgan used that capital to become the most powerful banker in America. This wasn't investing, it was front-running government policy with insider knowledge. The families who understood the bond market early got rich beyond measure, while everyone else scrambled to figure out what was happening. The Morgans weren't the only ones. D.J. Cook built a banking empire by selling Union bonds to European investors during the Civil War. He made so much money that he personally financed the construction of the Northern Pacific Railway after the war. But when that railroad project collapsed in 1873, it triggered the Panic of 1873, one of the worst economic depressions in American history. Cook's bank failed. Thousands of businesses went bankrupt. Unemployment hit 14%. But here's the thing. The families with real power didn't lose money in the panic. They made money, because economic crises are when assets get sold at fire sale prices. J.P. Morgan bought up railroads and industrial companies for pennies on the dollar. The Rockefellers expanded Standard Oil by acquiring bankrupt refineries. When Andrew Carnegie bought struggling steel mills and consolidated them into his empire, the pattern repeated throughout American economic history. Create a boom through government subsidies and easy credit, let smaller players overextend themselves, trigger a crash, buy everything at a discount, consolidate power, repeat. And the families that understood this pattern didn't just survive the crashes, they thrived because they had enough capital to wait out the chaos and enough political connections to shape the recovery in their favor. Let's talk about the DuPont family, because their story reveals another mechanism of wealth creation that nobody talks about: government contracts. Éleuthère Irénée Dupont arrived in America from France in 1800 with almost nothing. He started a gunpowder mill in Delaware in 1802. For the first 40 years, the business was modest. But then came the Civil War, and suddenly the Union Army needed gunpowder, lots of it. DuPont became the primary supplier. The company made millions. After the war, DuPont diversified into chemicals, explosives, and eventually synthetic materials like nylon. But the core of their wealth came from military contracts: World War I, World War II, the Cold War. Every major American conflict made the DuPont family richer. And they didn't just wait for contracts to come to them, they lobbied for military spending, funded politicians who supported defense budgets, and shaped foreign policy to create demand for their products. This is the military-industrial complex before Eisenhower ever warned about it. The DuPonts weren't alone. The Guggenheims made their fortune in mining and smelting, but they expanded through military contracts. The Mellons built Gulf Oil and Alcoa, both essential to military operations. These families didn't just benefit from American wars, they had a financial incentive to make sure wars kept happening. And here's the part that's almost too dark to fully process. The same families that profited from American wars also did business with America's enemies. During World War II, companies like Standard Oil and Chase Bank had financial relationships with Nazi Germany. They didn't care about ideology, they cared about profit. And when the war ended, they faced almost no consequences because they were too powerful to prosecute. Let's go back to the timeline, because the 30-year window between 1850 and 1880 wasn't random. It was the exact moment when three massive forces converged. The California gold rush brought an influx of capital. The Civil War created government demand for everything from railroads to weapons to bonds. And westward expansion gave the government an excuse to seize land and hand it over to corporations. The gold rush alone transferred over $550 million worth of gold into the American economy between 1848 and 1855. That's tens of billions in today's money. And where did that gold end up? In the banks controlled by families like the Morgans and the Mellons. Gold became the backing for currency. Currency became the tool for expansion. And expansion became the justification for monopoly. California went from a sleepy territory with less than 15,000 non-native settlers to a state with over 300,000 people in just 5 years. That kind of explosive growth required infrastructure: railroads, ports, banks. And the families who controlled that infrastructure didn't just get rich, they controlled the flow of capital across the entire western United States. Leland Stanford, the railroad baron, became governor of California in 1861. He used that position to grant his own railroad.